Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had always been a stickler for protocol. At 28, she commanded respect at Fort Harrison through her unwavering dedication to military precision and her ability to handle even the most difficult situations with calm authority. Her soldiers knew her as fair but firm, someone who would never ask them to do something she wouldn't do herself. The trouble began on a humid Tuesday morning in August. Sarah was conducting routine inspections of the barracks when she noticed something that made her blood boil. Private Jenkins, barely 19 and fresh out of basic training, was sitting alone in the corner of the mess hall, his uniform disheveled and his face bearing unmistakable signs of bruising around his left eye. Sarah had seen enough military hazing in her 6 years of service to recognize the signs immediately. She approached Jenkins with the measured steps of someone who had learned to control her emotions in volatile situations. "Private Jenkins, report to my office in 10 minutes, she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough authority to ensure he understood this wasn't a request. When Jenkins appeared at her door, he stood at attention with the rigid posture of someone trying very hard to appear fine when he clearly wasn't. Sarah gestured for him to sit in the chair across from her desk, noting how he winced slightly as he lowered himself down. "Tell me what happened to your face," Sarah said, her tone softer now but still commanding honesty. Jenkins stared straight ahead, his jaw set in the stubborn line she'd seen countless times before. "Nothing, ma'am. Just clumsy, walked into a door during night training." Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying the young soldier's face. She'd heard that excuse before, and it never involved the kind of bruising she was seeing. The pattern was too deliberate, too focused around the eye and cheek. This was the work of someone's fist, not a doorframe. "Private, I've been in the military long enough to know the difference between an accident and intentional harm. I'm going to ask you one more time, and I need you to understand that whatever you tell me will be handled appropriately through proper channels." For a moment, Jenkins's composure wavered. She could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes, the desire to tell the truth warring with whatever code of silence he felt bound to maintain. Finally, he shook his head. "It was nothing, Lieutenant. Just an accident." Sarah felt frustration building in her chest, but she'd been down this road before. Pushing too hard would only make Jenkins clam up further. Instead, she made a note in his file and dismissed him with instructions to report to the medical officer for a proper evaluation of his injuries. Over the next few days, Sarah kept a careful eye on Jenkins and began noticing disturbing patterns throughout her unit. Conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. Soldiers who seemed nervous around certain squad leaders. Equipment that went missing and then mysteriously reappeared. The signs all pointed to something systematic happening under her command, and it made her stomach turn. The breaking point came the following Friday during evening formation. Sarah was conducting the usual end-of-week inspection when she noticed Corporal Davidson, one of her more experienced non-commissioned officers, whispering something to a group of younger soldiers that made them all laugh in a way that set her teeth on edge. After dismissing the formation, Sarah approached Davidson directly. At 32, he was only 4 years older than her, but he carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed his experience trumped her authority. She'd had run-ins with his type before, soldiers who respected rank only when it suited them. "Corporal Davidson, I need to speak with you privately." Davidson's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flash of something that looked dangerously close to insubordination crossing his features before he masked it with professional compliance. "Of course, Lieutenant. What can I do for you?" They walked to a quiet area near the motor pool, away from curious ears. Sarah had learned early in her career that certain conversations were better held without an audience, especially when dealing with delicate matters of unit discipline. "I've been noticing some concerning behaviors in this unit lately," Sarah began, choosing her words carefully. "Soldiers showing up with unexplained injuries, missing equipment, and what appears to be a culture of intimidation among the enlisted personnel." Davidson's face remained neutral, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested her words had hit their mark. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, ma'am. The men under my supervision are all performing within acceptable parameters." The formality of his response, combined with the barely concealed condescension in his tone, told Sarah everything she needed to know. Davidson was not just aware of what was happening, he was likely orchestrating it. Corporal, let me be very clear about something. I will not tolerate any form of hazing, intimidation, or abuse in this unit. If I discover that you or anyone under your influence is participating in activities that harm other soldiers, I will see to it that appropriate disciplinary action is taken. For a moment, Davidson's mask slipped entirely. The look he gave her was one of pure disdain, the expression of someone who viewed her authority as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to be worked around. "You know, Lieutenant," he said, his voice dropping to a tone that was just barely within the bounds of military courtesy, "some of us have been doing this job since before you even knew which end of a rifle to hold. Maybe you should focus on the paperwork and let the real soldiers handle training the recruits." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, not from fear but from the kind of controlled anger that had served her well throughout her military career. She'd faced down insurgents in Afghanistan and managed complex logistics operations under fire, and she certainly wasn't going to be intimidated by a corporal with an attitude problem. "Corporal Davidson," she said, her voice taking on the steel edge that her soldiers had learned to recognize as a warning, "you seem to be operating under some misconceptions about how this chain of command works. Let me clarify something for you." She stepped closer, using her full height advantage. At 5'8", she stood nearly eye to eye with Davidson, and employed the kind of commanding presence that had been drilled into her during officer training. "I am a commissioned officer in the United States Army. You are a non-commissioned officer under my command. When I give you an order or express concern about the conduct of soldiers in this unit, your appropriate response is yes, ma'am, followed by immediate compliance. Your opinion of my qualifications or experience is neither requested nor relevant." Davidson's jaw clenched, and, for a moment, Sarah thought he might actually cross the line into open insubordination. Instead, he took a step back and delivered what could charitably be called a salute, though the mockery in it was barely concealed. "Understood, Lieutenant." "Will that be all?" Sarah studied his face for a long moment, memorizing every detail of his expression. She had the distinct feeling that this confrontation was far from over, and she wanted to be prepared for whatever came next. "That will be all for now, Corporal. But understand that I will be watching this unit very carefully going forward." Very carefully. As Davidson walked away, Sarah felt the weight of command settling heavily on her shoulders. She'd known when she accepted this posting that leading soldiers would come with challenges, but she hadn't anticipated the particular kind of resistance she was facing now. It wasn't just about military discipline, it was about something deeper and more troubling. That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters reviewing personnel files and incident reports, looking for patterns she might have missed. The picture that emerged was disturbing but not entirely surprising. Davidson had a history of complaints that had been filed and then mysteriously withdrawn. Young soldiers under his supervision had higher than average rates of minor injuries and disciplinary problems. The signs were all there, hidden in plain sight within the bureaucratic machinery of military record-keeping. As she prepared for bed, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to handle this through normal channels anymore. She wasn't going to wait for more soldiers to get hurt while she navigated the slow-moving wheels of military justice. She was going to take direct action, even if it meant putting her own career at risk. What Sarah didn't know was that her decision to cross certain lines in pursuit of justice was about to reveal secrets that would shake her understanding of everything she thought she knew about her own identity and place in the military hierarchy. The young lieutenant who went to sleep that night believing she understood the rules of engagement was about to discover that some battles couldn't be won through conventional means. The next morning would bring revelations that would force her to question not just Davidson's authority, but the very foundations of the command structure she had spent years learning to navigate. And, by the time the truth finally came to light, everyone at Fort Harrison would understand that Lieutenant Sarah Martinez was far more than she appeared to be. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Sarah's office. Major Williams, the executive officer of the base, appeared at her door with a grim expression that immediately put her on alert. Major Williams was known throughout Fort Harrison as a by-the-books officer who rarely involved himself in day-to-day unit operations unless something had gone seriously wrong. "Lieutenant Martinez, we need to talk," he said, closing the door behind him with more force than necessary. Sarah stood at attention, her mind racing through possible explanations for his presence. Had Davidson filed a complaint about their confrontation? Was there a new development in the hazing situation she'd been investigating? At ease, Major Williams said, taking a seat across from her desk. I've been hearing some concerning reports about tension in your unit. Specifically, reports that suggest you may be overstepping your authority with some of your non-commissioned officers. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She should have anticipated this. Davidson had likely gone straight to his connections higher up the chain of command to paint her as an inexperienced officer who didn't understand how things really worked in the Army. Sir, if this is about my conversation with Corporal Davidson yesterday, I can explain. Major Williams held up a hand to stop her. Lieutenant, let me be very clear about something. The Army runs on the expertise and experience of its NCOs. When young officers come in thinking they know better than soldiers who've been doing this job for over a decade, it creates problems. Serious problems. The condescension in his tone was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her carefully controlled temper beginning to flare. She'd heard variations of this speech before, the implication that her authority was somehow less legitimate because of her age or relative inexperience. Sir, with respect, this isn't about experience versus rank. This is about soldiers being abused by their superiors and a culture of intimidation that I will not tolerate in my unit. Major Williams's expression hardened. That's a very serious accusation, Lieutenant. Do you have proof of this alleged abuse? Sarah opened Jenkins's file and spread the medical documentation across her desk. Private Jenkins reported to the medical officer with injuries consistent with assault. When questioned, he claimed he walked into a door, but the pattern of bruising tells a different story. Additionally, I've documented multiple instances of equipment tampering, intimidation tactics, and suspicious behavior among soldiers under Corporal Davidson's supervision. Major Williams glanced at the papers with barely concealed impatience. Soldiers get injured during training, Lieutenant. Equipment malfunctions. Young recruits sometimes struggle with adaptation to military life. These are normal occurrences, not evidence of some conspiracy. Sir, I've been in the military for 6 years. I know the difference between normal training injuries and deliberate harm. 6 years, Major Williams repeated, his tone making it clear what he thought of her experience level. Corporal Davidson has been serving his country for 14 years. He's deployed to Iraq twice and Afghanistan once. He's trained hundreds of young soldiers who've gone on to serve with distinction. Are you really suggesting that someone with his record and experience is running some kind of abuse ring? Sarah felt the familiar frustration of being dismissed because of her age and rank, but she forced herself to remain calm. Getting emotional would only reinforce their preconceptions about young female officers. Sir, I'm suggesting that experience doesn't give anyone the right to abuse soldiers under their command. And I'm telling you that I have evidence of systematic mistreatment that needs to be investigated properly. Major Williams leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that mixed disappointment with barely concealed irritation. Lieutenant, I'm going to give you some advice. The Army is not a place for crusades. It's not a place for young officers who think they're going to come in and revolutionize how things work. Your job is to follow orders and support your NCOs, not to chase conspiracy theories. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She joined the Army believing in its values, honor, integrity, and the protection of those who couldn't protect themselves. To be told that pursuing those values made her a troublemaker was almost more than she could bear. Sir, are you ordering me to ignore evidence of abuse? I'm ordering you to focus on your actual responsibilities and stop interfering with the way Corporal Davidson runs his training programs. Is that clear? Sarah felt something shift inside her, a fundamental change in how she viewed the command structure she'd spent years respecting. She could say yes, sir, and walk away, protect her career and avoid making waves. Or she could do what she knew was right, regardless of the consequences. Crystal clear, sir, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. After Major Williams left, Sarah sat alone in her office, staring at the evidence spread across her desk. The message had been delivered loud and clear: toe the line or face the consequences. But Sarah had never been good at backing down from a fight, especially when innocent soldiers were being hurt. That afternoon, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going through official channels, she began conducting her own investigation. She started by quietly interviewing soldiers who she suspected might have information about Davidson's activities, always careful to make it seem like routine check-ins rather than formal questioning. The picture that emerged over the next few days was even worse than she'd imagined. Davidson wasn't just engaging in casual hazing, he was running what amounted to a systematic campaign of intimidation designed to break down recruits and rebuild them according to his own twisted vision of what a soldier should be. Private Rodriguez told her about being forced to clean latrines with his bare hands while Davidson and his cronies watched and laughed. Private Thompson described being awakened in the middle of the night for surprise inspections that involved being screamed at and physically pushed around. And Jenkins, when she finally convinced him to open up, revealed that the black eye was just the most recent in a series of training accidents that had left him bruised and demoralized. The more Sarah learned, the angrier she became. These weren't soldiers being trained, they were young people being systematically abused by someone who had twisted his position of authority into a license to inflict pain and humiliation. But what truly shocked her was the revelation that came when she was reviewing Davidson's service record more carefully. Hidden in the administrative details was information that made her blood run cold. Davidson had been investigated for similar activities at his previous posting, but the investigation had been quietly closed without explanation. The soldiers who had filed complaints had been transferred to other units, and Davidson had received what amounted to a clean slate. Sarah realized she was looking at evidence of a cover-up that went much higher than Fort Harrison. Davidson wasn't just a rogue NCO, he was part of a system that protected certain people while throwing others under the bus. That night, Sarah sat in her quarters with a secure laptop, composing an email that she knew would likely end her military career. She was preparing to send a detailed report directly to the Inspector General's office, bypassing the chain of command entirely. As she typed, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed over the past week. She'd always believed that doing the right thing would be supported by the system she served. Now she understood that sometimes doing the right thing meant working against that system, even if it cost her everything she'd worked for. What Sarah didn't know was that her email would trigger a chain of events that would reveal secrets about her own background that had been carefully hidden for nearly 3 decades. The investigation she was about to launch would uncover not just Davidson's crimes, but connections that reached to the very highest levels of military command. As she prepared to hit send, Sarah had no idea that within 48 hours, she would discover that her authority to investigate Davidson came from sources far more powerful than her lieutenant's commission. The young woman who believed she was risking everything to protect a few recruits was about to learn that she had been protecting soldiers her entire life, in ways she never could have imagined. Her finger hovered over the send button for a long moment, and then, she pressed it. Whatever came next, she would face it with the knowledge that she had done what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The email disappeared into the vast network of military communications, carrying with it the power to change everything Sarah thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. 48 hours after sending her report to the Inspector General, Sarah's world turned upside down in ways she never could have anticipated. She was in her office reviewing training schedules when her door burst open without a knock. 3 people entered, a stern-faced woman in a colonel's uniform she didn't recognize, a man in civilian clothes carrying a briefcase, and, behind them, looking completely stunned, Major Williams. "Lieutenant Martinez," the colonel said, her voice carrying an authority that made Major Williams look like a cadet. "I'm Colonel Patricia Harrison, and we need to talk immediately." Sarah stood at attention, her mind racing to process what was happening. Colonel Harrison's name was familiar, but she couldn't place where she'd heard it before. The civilian looked like federal law enforcement, and Major Williams appeared to be in some kind of shock. "At ease, Lieutenant," Colonel Harrison said, then turned to Major Williams. "Major, you're dismissed. And you're to speak to no one about this meeting until further notice. Is that understood?" Major Williams nodded mutely and left the room, closing the door behind him with trembling hands. Sarah had never seen him look so shaken, and it sent alarm bells ringing in her head. Colonel Harrison took a seat across from Sarah's desk, while the civilian remained standing by the door. The colonel's expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that looked almost like recognition. Lieutenant, your report to the Inspector General has created quite a stir. The investigation into Corporal Davidson and the cover-up of his previous activities has already resulted in several arrests at the Pentagon level. You've uncovered something much bigger than simple unit-level hazing. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that her concerns were being taken seriously, and apprehension about what much bigger might mean for her career. However, Colonel Harrison continued, your investigation also triggered some automated security protocols that have revealed information that changes everything about this situation. Information about you, specifically. About me, ma'am? The civilian stepped forward and opened his briefcase, withdrawing a thick file that he placed on Sarah's desk. Lieutenant Martinez, I'm Agent Thompson with Army Intelligence. What I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels, and it's going to be difficult to hear. Sarah stared at the file, noting her name printed on the cover in large letters. Below her name were classification markings she'd never seen before, along with what appeared to be a birth date that was different from her own records. Lieutenant, Colonel Harrison said, her voice gentler now, 28 years ago, a 5-year-old girl disappeared from a family barbecue at Fort Bragg. Her parents were both high-ranking military officers involved in sensitive intelligence work. Despite an extensive search, she was never found. Sarah's hands began to tremble slightly. Ma'am, I'm not sure what this has to do with, that little girl's name was Sarah Elizabeth Harrison, the colonel continued. She was my daughter. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stared at Colonel Harrison's face, looking for similarities she hadn't noticed before, trying to process information that didn't make sense with everything she thought she knew about her own life. That's impossible, Sarah whispered. My parents are Robert and Maria Martinez. I was born in El Paso, Texas. I have birth certificates, school records. Agent Thompson opened the file and withdrew a DNA analysis report. When you entered the military, your blood sample was routinely processed through various databases. 6 years ago, it matched DNA collected from Sarah Harrison's bedroom before her disappearance. The match was flagged and classified pending further investigation. Why wasn't I told? Sarah demanded, her voice rising despite her efforts to maintain composure. Because, Colonel Harrison said, tears forming in her eyes for the first time since entering the room, we needed to determine whether you had been kidnapped by foreign agents and raised as a sleeper operative, or whether something else had happened. The investigation has been ongoing for 6 years. Sarah's mind reeled as she tried to process the implications. Everything she thought she knew about her identity, her family, her entire life, was apparently built on lies. The people who raised me, she said slowly, the Martinez family, were deep-cover intelligence operatives, Agent Thompson explained. Robert Martinez was working a long-term assignment that required him to disappear from his previous identity. When you went missing, he and his partner Maria were supposed to be extracted from their assignment. Instead, they found you wandering alone on a highway outside El Paso, apparently having escaped from whoever had taken you. You had no memory of your previous life. Colonel Harrison leaned forward, her professional composure finally cracking. Robert and Maria were supposed to turn you over to authorities so you could be returned to us. Instead, they made the decision to raise you as their own daughter. They created new identities for all 3 of you and spent the next 23 years hiding from military intelligence. They saved my life, Sarah said fiercely, feeling a surge of protective anger toward the people she'd always known as her parents. Yes, Colonel Harrison agreed. They did. And they gave you a good life, Sarah. But they also committed treason by concealing your identity and location from the government. Sarah felt as though the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Are they in custody? Agent Thompson shook his head. Robert Martinez died 4 years ago. Maria Martinez died 2 years ago. According to the investigation, they never revealed your true identity to anyone, including you. The loss hit Sarah anew, complicated now by the realization that the people who had raised her had been living with an enormous secret their entire lives. They had chosen to love her and protect her even though it meant becoming fugitives from their own government. There's more, Colonel Harrison said gently. Sarah, you're not just my daughter. You're the daughter of 2 Army colonels. By birth and, by lineage, your security clearance and authority level is significantly higher than your current rank reflects. Agent Thompson withdrew another document from the file. Lieutenant Martinez, effective immediately, you're being promoted to the rank of Major, with retroactive authority dating back to your original commission. Additionally, you're being read into several classified programs that your birth parents were involved in. Sarah stared at the promotion orders, trying to make sense of how her life had changed so dramatically in the span of one conversation. What does this mean for my investigation into Davidson? It means, Colonel Harrison said with a smile that was equal parts pride and relief, that you had the authority to investigate him all along. It also means that Major Williams and everyone else who tried to intimidate you into backing down just committed career-ending mistakes by attempting to obstruct a superior officer. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She'd been told to respect Davidson's experience and authority, when in reality her authority superseded his by several levels. The system that had tried to silence her had been protecting the wrong person all along. Over the next hour, Colonel Harrison and Agent Thompson walked Sarah through 28 years of hidden history. They showed her photos of herself as a child, explained the circumstances of her disappearance, and detailed the extensive investigation that had been conducted to find her. Your father wanted to be here, Colonel Harrison explained, but he's deployed in a location I can't discuss. He's been informed that you've been found, and he's requesting immediate leave to meet you. Sarah found herself nodding, though she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. What happens now? Now, Colonel Harrison said, you have choices to make. You can request a transfer to work with me directly, which would involve high-level intelligence work similar to what your birth parents did. You can remain in your current assignment with your new rank and authority. Or you can request time to process all of this before making any major decisions. What about Davidson and the soldiers he's been abusing? Agent Thompson smiled grimly. Corporal Davidson was arrested this morning along with 4 other NCOs involved in his activities. Major Williams has been relieved of duty pending investigation. The soldiers who were being abused are receiving counseling and medical care, and several of them have specifically requested to remain under your command. Sarah felt a profound sense of relief. The soldiers would be safe, and the people who had protected Davidson's behavior would face consequences for their actions. There's one more thing, Colonel Harrison said, reaching into her own briefcase. She withdrew a small wooden jewelry box and placed it on Sarah's desk. This was yours when you were 5 years old. I've been carrying it with me for 28 years, hoping someday I'd be able to give it back to you. Sarah opened the box with trembling hands. Inside was a small silver locket with an engraved heart. When she opened the locket, she found a tiny photograph of Colonel Harrison and a man in army dress uniform, both smiling at the camera. Your father and I, on our wedding day, Colonel Harrison explained. You used to wear that locket everywhere. As Sarah held the locket, something shifted in her memory. Not a clear recollection, but a feeling of familiarity, a sense of coming home to something she hadn't realized she'd been missing. I'd like to stay in my current assignment for now, Sarah said finally. These soldiers have been through enough disruption. They need stability and leadership they can trust. Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly. That's exactly what I would have expected you to say. Your sense of duty and protection for those under your command is something you definitely inherited from both sides of your family. As the meeting concluded and the paperwork was signed, Sarah found herself promoted from lieutenant to major, cleared for classified programs she'd never known existed, and reunited with a family she'd never known she'd lost. That evening, as Major Sarah Martinez sat in her quarters looking at the locket and her new promotion orders, she reflected on how dramatically her understanding of herself had changed. She'd started the week as a lieutenant trying to protect a few soldiers from an abusive NCO. She was ending it as a major who had exposed a military cover-up and discovered her own hidden identity. The next morning, when she walked into the unit area wearing her new rank insignia, the soldiers under her command snapped to attention with genuine respect and admiration. They'd heard through the military grapevine that their lieutenant had taken down an entire network of corrupt officials to protect them. Private Jenkins approached her after formation, his bruises finally healed, with a question that made her smile. "Ma'am, is it true that you outranked all those guys who were trying to shut down your investigation?" Sarah looked at the young soldier who had started this entire chain of events by trusting her enough to let her see his injuries, and she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Sometimes, Private, the most important thing isn't what rank you hold. It's what you do with whatever authority you have, no matter how small it might seem. As she walked away, Sarah realized that she'd learned something fundamental about leadership and courage. She'd crossed lines and risked everything to protect soldiers under her command, only to discover that she'd had the authority to cross those lines all along. But, more importantly, she'd learned that doing the right thing didn't depend on rank or authority or family connections. It depended on the willingness to act when action was needed, regardless of the personal cost. The lieutenant who had crossed the line to protect her soldiers had indeed outranked them all. But, the major who emerged from that experience understood that true authority came not from the insignia on her collar, but from the trust of the soldiers who depended on her to do what was right, no matter what obstacles stood in her way.